Hi, my name is Madeline Duncan, and this is my presentation titled The Defining Features of Opposing Classes, a Marxist Analysis of the Novel Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng. So, Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng follows the lives of two families, the Richardsons and the Warrens, as they navigate daily life in the town of Shaker Heights. Through character interactions and experiences, Ng explores concepts including how class differences contribute to the integrity of the plot, the development of dynamic character relationships, and the essence of the individual characters. There are significant differences between bourgeoisie and proletariat characters that lead to specific opportunities, vulnerabilities, and differences in perspective. This paper seeks to understand Ng's novel from a Marxist perspective, specifically focusing on class differences and how those differences affect the lives of the individual characters. So, the divide that exists between characters of opposing classes is strengthened dramatically by how they perceive one another. Throughout the story, upper-class characters view their working-class counterparts with a distinct lack of empathy. Having never experienced financial struggles to the same degree, they have no idea of the emotional, physical, and social toll it can take on the individual level. It is extremely common for wealthy characters such as Mrs. Richardson and Mrs. McCullough to assume that the hardships which impoverished characters such as Mia and Bibi experience are self-inflicted, the result of character defects such as disorganization, irresponsibility, and a lack of motivation. This story falls into a pattern of the bourgeoisie looking down on their proletariat as though they were less than and incapable of sufficiently helping themselves. So in the story, a power dynamic forms between Mia and Mrs. Richardson. Mrs. Richardson considers Mia to be in need of her assistance and believes any act of charity on her part should be regarded as magnanimous and received with emphatic gratitude. This quote clearly displays that relationship. She thought again of Mia's disaffection when she'd offered to buy one of Mia's photos, of Mia's reticence about her past, of Mia's, standoffishness, even as she spent hours a day in Mrs. Richardson's own home in this very kitchen, a woman whose wages she paid, whose rent she subsidized, whose daughters spent hours and hours under this very roof every single day. So this example is a clear illustration of the capacity for oppression that exists between the characters of opposing classes. According to contemporary Marxism, a defining characteristic of the bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie class is the exploitation of the working class through personal assets owned by the bourgeoisie. Upper-class individuals hold their assets over the heads of those who do not own anything for the sake of power and personal gain. Mrs. Richardson is in possession of and responsible for multiple assets that Mia relies on to be able to function in her day-to-day life, a position she regularly exploits through her sense of entitlement. Ng brings attention to Mrs. Richardson's blatant outrage over not being given the respect and gratitude that she believes she deserves. She feels entitled to Mia's respect and adoration because of her position as both her landlord and employer. So we can examine the inverse of the relationship between Mia and Mrs. Richardson from Mia's perspective to better understand how proletariat characters view bourgeoisie characters in the novel. Although Mrs. Richardson feels magnanimous and generous while committing acts of charity, Mia instead views her as patronizing and feels as though Mrs. Richardson thinks less of her because of her low-class status. This concept is highlighted when Ng writes about an exchange that occurs between the two women. "That's very generous of you." Mia's eyes slid toward the window briefly, and Mrs. Richardson felt a twinge of irritation at this lukewarm response to her philanthropy. So in this line, Mrs. Richardson feels pity for Mia's lack of money and consequent lifestyle and offers to buy one of her photographs. When Mia reacts with less enthusiasm than Mrs. Richardson had anticipated, the effect is Mrs. Richardson feeling insulted. Mia does not want charity from someone of a higher class. She doesn't like to feel pitied or looked down on. Essentially, she does not want to be made to feel weak or incompetent or put herself into a position to be taken advantage of, especially by someone who has power over her. So some characters are also granted specific opportunities because of their upper class status, opportunities that lower class characters do not have access to. There are certain privileges associated with being wealthy, In Little Fires Everywhere, that potential for advantage is represented by a character's place within the superstructure of Shaker Heights. When conferring about prospective colleges, Lexi's guidance counselor tells her, "They know kids from Shaker always go on to do well. They'll give you an edge." Here, Lexi and her counselor are discussing her chances of getting into Yale and the added advantage of her coming from Shaker Heights. The superstructure favors the wealthy because the benefits to living in Shaker are only available for those who can afford to live there. So, similar to advantages available to those with upper class status are the opportunities specifically associated with wealth. In the novel, an extremely clear example of these wealth-based opportunities arise during the custody battle between the McCulloughs, the baby's potential adoptive parents, and Bibi Chow, her biological mother. So this is an extremely complicated issue with seemingly countless angles to consider. However, one of the most prominent points being addressed throughout the trial is that because they are significantly wealthier than Bibi Chow, the McCulloughs are better equipped to take care of the baby and provide a good life for her. Ing writes, "Mark and Linda McCullough, it was quite clear, had all the necessary resources for raising a child. Mr. McCullough had a steady, well-paying job. Mrs. McCullough had, for the past 14 months, been a full-time mother to the baby and planned to be so indefinitely. They owned their own home in a safe, affluent neighborhood. Overall, they were in the 96th percentile financially. The McCulloughs live an idyllic, picturesque life. They own a large home. Mr. McCullough has a good job that pays well, and they can afford to give the baby the best of everything. Because they are so well off financially, they can afford to have one parent, Mrs. McCullough, stay home with the baby, opposed to having to enroll her in daycare for a larger portion of the day. It is argued that this quality family time helps the McCulloughs maintain a larger influence in the way she is raised." The idea that money opens doors for wealthy citizens in Shaker Heights is a concept that easily translates to the real world. The wealthy have more resources available to them and access to more opportunities and greater experiences. In the end, it was decided that the baby would have a higher quality life with the McCulloughs because of their wealth. So the capitalist economic system in this novel forces low-class individuals into vulnerable positions in which they become reliant on the assets of wealthier citizens. In Ing's novel, proletariat characters are forced to make difficult decisions directly related to money, decisions that their bourgeoisie counterparts would never have to consider making. So as an example, right out of high school, young Mia is following her dream and attending a prestigious art school. She is struggling to get by. Even with a scholarship that covers her entire tuition, she has to work 3 jobs and still barely makes her rent. When her scholarship gets cut off, she is put into a financially compromising position. She has to sincerely consider a proposal offered to her by a couple who cannot conceive themselves but desperately want a child, a proposal that she ultimately agrees to. The Ryans offered Mia $10,000 to conceive a child with Mr. Ryan, carry it to term, and then hand the baby over after its birth. So about that experience, Ing writes, "In the end, she told herself it was the math that decided her. The Ryans' offer was enough to pay for 3 more terms of school. It would buy her time to earn enough money to pay for the rest. If she did this, she could continue. If she did not, she could not. Put that way, the choice seemed obvious." So Mia can think of no other way to fund her education. She is forced into a vulnerable position by her desire to pursue an education at an institution that favors the wealthy. If she had had enough money to attend school in the first place, she never would have had to consider doing something that she believed to be morally reprehensible. Society forces her to choose between her dream of attending art school and her ethics. So, another important difference between the bourgeoisie and proletariat characters is how class differences affect the children of opposing classes. So, Ing holds 2 families side by side, the Richardsons and the Warrens, in order to examine the profound differences in both the ways they were raised and how these lifestyle differences affect the adults they are starting to become. Ing comments on the Richardsons' wealth when she writes, Moody had never thought much about money because he had never needed to. Lights went on when he flipped switches. Water came out when he turned the tap. Groceries appeared in the refrigerator at regular intervals and reappeared as cooked meals on the table at mealtimes. Moody Richardson's life has always been easy and stable. Growing up, he received a good quality education and went on regular family vacations. The fact that he has never had to consider financial issues before is a testament to his family's lack of financial problems. It also portrays his naivete regarding how lower-class families live. He was raised in a wealthy, affluent neighborhood surrounded by people who resembled his own family. In regards to their upbringings, Pearl Warren, Mia's daughter, is Moody's polar opposite. She was raised in an extremely poor household, constantly moving around and transferring schools. She was not unaccustomed to sleeping in her mom's car. When she and her mom rented apartments, they were generally in low-income neighborhoods, and for lack of space, she and Mia almost always had shared a bed. Everything they owned was used. About Pearl's first encounter with the Richardson family, Ing writes, Later, it would seem to Pearl that the Richardsons must have arranged themselves in a tableau for her enjoyment, for surely they could not always exist in this state of domestic perfection. So here, Pearl is meeting the Richardsons for the first time, and because of her lack of experience with upper-class families, she thought they purposely staged themselves around their house for her benefit. She did not realize that people actually lived the way the Richardsons did. She thought that this sort of nuclear family was fabricated for entertainment purposes, portrayed on television, but completely unrealistic. Similarly to Moody, Pearl is naive about the lives of upper-class families. The only experience she has ever had have been with low-income families similar to her own. Both Pearl and Moody's realities are completely foreign to one another. Neither had any idea that people actually lived the way the other does, because they were both essentially stuck within the parameters of their respective social classes. The next generation tends to inherit their parents' opportunities or their vulnerabilities depending on the class they are born into. Children born into wealthy families typically go on to be wealthy adults, while children born into poverty tend to live their lives poor. Like other concepts explored in this novel, this one easily translates to the real world. Class division is practically impossible to overcome, especially for children born into the only reality they have ever known. So, in conclusion, there are numerous differences between the upper and lower class, with the most consistent concept being that upper class characters are always advantaged over lower class characters. As depicted in the novel, the class someone is born into almost always decides how they will live the rest of their life. Through her negative portrayal of class division and the dangers that it poses to society, Ing alludes to being in favor of an anti-capitalist economic system. Here's my works cited. Thank you for watching.